Good morning. We want to spend some time and examine issues pertaining to conceptual framework. In our examination of this concept, we want to look at the meaning of a conceptual framework, the purpose of a conceptual framework, the types of conceptual frameworks that exist, and the steps that are followed when constructing a conceptual framework. Welcome to this discussion. A conceptual framework has been described variously, and some scholars understand it as the researcher's understanding of how the independent and dependent variables in the study connect or interact in the real world. It is understood as a written or visual representation of the expected relationship between variables in the study. When we look at the two definitions, what we need to emphasize is that every study is required to have two types of variables. These are independent and dependent variables. That is one of the criteria that defines a good study and also good study objectives. So that when a researcher undertakes a given study, the broader purpose of that study is to see how independent and dependent variables interact in the actual field of study. And sometimes the assumption or the conceptualization of how they interact is normally presented in a visual form or in a diagram form, so that at times a conceptual framework is understood as the diagrammatical representation or rather presentation by a researcher on how he or she believes the independent and dependent variables in the study would react in the actual field of study. Therefore, a conceptual framework is generally developed based on the research problem, objectives of the study, and or research questions. In other words, before you consider coming up with a conceptual framework, it is required of a researcher to have a research problem, to have specific objectives for the study, or research questions. These are the minimum things or requirements that every study must have for a conceptual framework to be developed. What are the purposes or the purpose of a conceptual framework? The conceptual framework, one, serves as a tool in analyzing the state of variables or concepts and the interactions for a comprehensive understanding of phenomena, and this helps in guiding researchers' thinking during data collection, analysis, and interpretation. In other words, we use a conceptual framework to help us in analyzing how the various types of variables, and in our case, independent and dependent variables, interact with each other, so that the findings of our studies are interpreted in the context of the relationship that were assumed to exist at the time we constructed our conceptual framework. The other thing is that a conceptual framework helps the researcher in identifying the variables of the study, which further helps the researcher in identifying appropriate statistical tools to be used in analyzing the differences or relationships between variables. We noted, as we are going to note later, one of the things that a researcher does is to identify the sets of variables that exist in the study while constructing a conceptual framework. And these are the independent and dependent variables. Once that is done, then a researcher also goes further to identify the attributes that exist or that he or she wishes to focus on in each of the variables. Now, depending on the type of data that's available, then it is possible for the researcher to decide which statistical tools is appropriate in the analysis of those variables. Again, this is based on the type of data to be collected. And I want to refer students to the slides that I presented earlier on population and data, where we have talked about the different types of data. So different types of data might call for different statistical tools to be used in analyzing whether or not there are relationships that exist between the major variables that have been identified in the study. Taxonomy basically is a type of conceptual framework that relies on verbal description and which categorizes phenomena into classes. The relationships that exist in this type of conceptual framework are outlined, even though they may not have been those that have arrived up through empirical inquiries, that is, through scientific studies. And therefore, this type of conceptual framework does not show relationship between variables. It simply offers groupings, just like we have taxonomy in biology, where living things are classified according to a certain criteria that are offered by biologists. That criteria show the various classes that organisms normally fall. And therefore, evidence for the phenomena that are presented under this type of conceptual framework, they result from direct experience, or they're developed from logical reasoning, or in some cases, they're developed from empirical studies. The findings of this type of conceptual framework are criticized generally for lacking the scientific rigor. If you recall, in our discussion of suicide, for instance, the types of suicides that are provided by Emil Durkheim, that is, anomie, fatalistic, altruistic, and egoistic suicides, can be easily understood as the taxonomy of suicide, that is, the various types of suicides. These suicides were based on observations that pioneer sociologists observed occurring during the upheavals in Europe. And when they looked at these suicides, there was a clear pattern that certain elements could be found in certain types of suicide that were occurring. And therefore, based on that, they were able to come up with the various categories of suicide. So the type of suicide that exists as provided by sociologists is an example of taxonomy. I also want to emphasize again here that this type of conceptual framework is not much used in social sciences, but there are instances where they are used in studies such as psychology, especially psychological studies that are leaning more towards the natural sciences. Otherwise, those that lean more toward the social sciences, they mostly adopt the visual representation type of conceptual framework that we're just about to begin discussing. Visual presentation is yet another type of conceptual framework that is popularly employed in research. In this type of conceptual framework, a picture of the relationship between the variables is provided without necessarily showing the strength of the relationship. The evidence in support of the existence of the relationship between variables should be provided, and such evidence should be logical and empirically supported. When we talk of something being empirically supported, it simply means that the evidence that is supporting it is one that is based or obtained from actual research. The evidence may come from authority, research, but may also not be very rigorous. Authority are institutions and individuals that are held in high esteem, and the issues that are presented there are considered as truth. For instance, the Constitution is an authority. The holy books, the Bible, the Quran, and others are authorities. Authorities might also be institutions, such as judgments that are made in court, among others. So those authorities, they are considered as evidence and assumed or treated as logical. In other words, truth that are rigorously arrived at. Most of the studies that you will be encountering in future as social scientists will be based on the visual representation, so that most of the type of conceptual framework that you are likely to adopt in your future studies, be it policy studies or academic studies, they're likely to be those that are guided by visual representation. Therefore, at the end of this presentation, I'm going to provide an illustration of how a visual representation type of conceptual framework is constructed. The other type of conceptual framework is called mathematical description. This is a type of conceptual framework in which the phenomena can be expressed in some type of mathematical equation. This type of conceptual framework shows the strength of the relationships between variables, unlike the other two that of the type of conceptual frameworks that do not show. This type of conceptual framework also requires empirical evidence, but not a logical explanation. In other words, if you are to come up with a mathematical description, or if you choose to take the route of mathematical description in the development of your conceptual framework, then what is required of you is to provide evidence that the kind of relationships you are intending, or you are assuming, or you are proposing to exist between the variables, they actually exist based on scientific evidence of practical researches that have been done, peer-reviewed, and generally accepted by the academia as being valid and sound. So in that case, therefore, you're required to have them. Mathematical description is a type of conceptual framework is largely used in studies of economics, mathematics, as well as physical sciences. They don't apply much in the studies of social sciences, and therefore, most of the times, students of social sciences would be invited to use the other types of conceptual framework. Let us now look at the steps that a researcher is required to follow while constructing a conceptual framework. The first step is that you must identify a research problem. What is it that you want to study? The second step is that you decide on the study objectives. What are the objectives that a researcher wants to use to guide him or her in answering the issues that are being identified in the research problem? Number three, you identify the independent and dependent variables that are in any given study, so that it is clear which variables are independent and which variables are dependent. This is important because a conceptual framework basically is to present an assumption of how independent and dependent variables would interact in the real field. Number four, you identify the attributes of each variable. In other words, each of the independent and dependent variables in the study must have certain attributes so that we divide each independent variable into their constituent parts, the small issues, the narrow issues that we will be examining and which will constitute that particular independent variable. The step 5, we present the framework diagrammatically. Once the variables have been identified and the attributes of each variables have been found or delineated, then the next step is now to present the framework diagrammatically. Then step 6, you explain the possible outcomes or the possible relationships that a researcher believes would exist between the independent and dependent variables. We want to have the next discussion as an illustration on exactly how this can be presented in actual research situation. Let's now turn our attention on how a conceptual framework can be presented. As I noted earlier, the first step is to identify a research problem. The second step is to identify the research objectives. From there on, you identify the variables, then the attributes of variables, then you now make a presentation of the actual conceptual framework. In our case here, we have a research problem of a hypothetical study, followed by the general objective, and then we have the specific objectives. If we look at this, we want to then see how this research problem and specific objectives can be used to come up with a conceptual framework. Our research problem is the effects of occupational stress on employees' commitment in savings and credit cooperative societies in Nakuru County. And our specific objectives are to examine the effects of job characteristics on commitment of employees of savings and credit cooperative societies in Nakuru County, Kenya. The second one, to assess the effects of reward systems on commitment of employees of savings and credit cooperative societies in Nakuru County, Kenya. And then the third one, to explore the effects of personal characteristics on commitment of employees of savings and credit cooperative societies in Nakuru, Kenya. We want to use this now to come up with a model conceptual framework that we can use to guide us when we are now constructing our own conceptual framework when faced with the task of doing so. The first thing that we do when we are constructing a conceptual framework is to have the title of that conceptual framework. Like in our case, the title is The Relationship Between Occupational Stress and Employees' Commitment. We derive the title of a conceptual framework from the research problem. Then the next thing that we do is to identify the two sets of variables, that is, independent variables and the dependent variables. In our case, we have 3 independent variables and 1 dependent variables. As you recall in our discussion in class, I stated that the number of independent variables a study has is determined by the number of objectives. So that if you have a study with 3 objectives, like in our case here, then we are going to have 3 independent variables. But there's only 1 dependent variable for any given study if the objectives are well constructed. So that in our case, we have job characteristics, our first independent variable, personal characteristics, our second independent variable, and then reward systems as our third independent variable. Then our dependent variable is employee commitment. When we look at each of these variables, again, we stated earlier that you must come up with attributes of each variable. That is, what are the specific issues that you intend to examine in this particular research? So that if you pick job characteristics, what are the issues that you want to look at under job characteristics. Because job characteristics can be as many as, say, 20, but realistically, it's not possible to study all the possible job characteristics that exist in any study. So you pick a few that you intend to focus on to give you a picture of how job characteristics affect employee commitment. In our case, therefore, we have skill variety, job security, and autonomy. These are therefore the attributes of job characteristics that we intend to examine in this study. Now, second objective, we have personal characteristics. That is, what are the attributes of employees that you intend to examine and in which you can make inference regarding how they affect employee commitment. So in this case, we have education level of the employee, work experience of the employee, as well as the gender of employee. Then when you come to the third objective, or rather the third independent variable, which is reward systems, again, we have three attributes: monetary rewards, career advancement, and awards. Again, these are the attributes or the specific issues that you want to focus on so that you have a picture of how reward systems affect employee commitment. When it comes to employee commitment, we have three attributes that we want, again, to focus on. And these are affective, continuance, and normative. So these are the issues that we intend to examine. So once you have grouped each of these characteristics, independent variables and the attributes, then you now draw them and then come up with a chart. So this, or a diagram. This diagram should point where the independent variables are and where the dependent variables are. Then you draw an arrow that emanates from independent variable to the dependent variable to show that they affect employee commitment. So this is an example of a conceptual framework. So we can be guided by this conceptual framework to come up with a conceptual framework wherever we face the task or we assign the task of coming up with a conceptual framework for any given study. And as we have said earlier, you start at problem identification, objective, identification of variables, identification of study attributes, or rather variable attributes, and then you now draw the conceptual framework. At that point, we come to the end of our discussion. I believe that through this discussion, we have gained additional insight onto what a conceptual framework is and how it can be constructed, given the steps that I have just explained above. Thank you so much for your time.